longer a death sentence. And that's because we invested in research to identify early detection, treatment, cocktails of treatment. And so in thinking about that, we've invested in the research and we've turned the tides on HIV, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and we can do the same thing for Alzheimer's disease. In the United States in 2011, passed into law was the first National Alzheimer's Project Act. And what that did is it set on a national scale legislation that made Alzheimer's disease a national priority. Resulting from that was the first ever national plan to address Alzheimer's disease, and that was published in May of 2012. And it has a number of different goals. As you can see, the 5 main goals listed here, including enhancing care quality and efficiency, expanding support for people with Alzheimer's disease and their families. Encompassed in that is also related dementias, enhancing public engagement, and improving data to track progress of what we're families that are affected by this disease. And the one that's specific to biomedical research is to prevent and effectively treat Alzheimer's disease by 2025. So that's only a decade away. And we're going to talk about some of the ongoing happenings, and as we're putting some of those, if you think about it as a large puzzle, as we're putting these pieces together, how close we are to achieving this goal of effectively preventing and treating Alzheimer's by 2025. A side note, the Alzheimer's Association actually convened an international expert working group of scientists to say, do we have the science, do we have the technology, and what are the resources to actually achieve this goal? And this international expert working group said, yes, we do, yes, we can, and it's going to take around $2 billion a year over a period of 10 years to achieve that goal. And here's a map, here's a roadmap to get us there. And actually, if you go back to the National Alzheimer's Project Act, and the resulting plan, we've seen incremental increases in funding. And last year we funded research at around $650 million, so a little bit away from that $2 billion mark. And at the end, we're going to come back to some current and ongoing activities in Washington, D.C. that may continue to move that needle forward as we continue to increase funding for research. So in thinking about this large puzzle, there's a few different pieces that we want to fit together. And one is, who's at the greatest risk? Who's at the greatest risk for developing Alzheimer's disease? We don't know what the cause of Alzheimer's is, and in fact, we don't know the cause of what many of the underlying dementia, causes of dementia are. As Sam said, part of the reason that it's so important if you're concerned about yourself or a loved one or someone else that you're providing care for, to speak to a healthcare professional, to have a full workup, is because there are instances where dementia is reversible. So things like a hormonal imbalance or nutritional imbalance, for instance. There are other instances where it's not reversible, like Alzheimer's disease, like frontotemporal dementia. But the care for an individual may actually vary depending on the underlying cause of their memory loss, of their dementia. So when we think about risk factors, there's a lot that we don't understand about the different dementias. But if we look at Alzheimer's disease specifically, you might see something like this in the brains of these individuals. And so you're going to hear me talk about these terms interchangeably or as we go. This is actually a picture of Dr. Alois Alzheimer on the bottom, and a picture of Alois Dieter, who was the first known person that was affected by Alzheimer's disease. She was described as living with Alzheimer's disease, but of course we now know it probably had existed many, many centuries before Alois was described. And when you look in the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's disease, you'd see something a little bit like this. Between the brain cells, we see these large clumps that come together. Those are called plaques. The primary component of the plaques is a protein known as beta amyloid. Inside the brain cells, and if you look under a microscope, it looks like a giant hair tangle, and that's inside the brain cells. We have what we call neurofibrillary tangles, and they got their name because of how they look on the microscope. The primary component of the neurofibrillary tangles is a protein known as tau. So particularly when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, you often hear beta amyloid and tau talked about in terms of diagnostic tools that are being developed or treatments as targets. A side note, tau is actually present, and this clumping of the tau protein in the tangles is actually present in a number of different causes of dementia, including frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, Parkinsonism dementia as well. So there are some commonalities, even at the basic science level, between some of these different diseases. Again, we don't know the cause of the majority of these diseases, but when we think about risk, when we think about what may increase somebody's risk, we can talk about age as the greatest known risk factor, and that's specific for Alzheimer's disease and several of the related disorders. there's a connection to heart health and head and brain health. So if you think about it, it makes sense. Our hearts are pumping blood through our entire body, including to our brain for our everyday resource, oxygen and food. And so if our hearts aren't healthy, it's going to impact the efficiency and effectiveness that it actually gets blood to our brain. So if our cardiovascular disease, people with cardiovascular disease, people with diabetes, those types of things have an increased risk in later life for Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. Exactly what's happening on a science, on an underlying biological level, we don't completely understand. But there is evidence to suggest that managing cardiovascular factors may be beneficial to later life risk. Head injury. We've seen a number of studies that have looked at head injury, and it's linked to later life risk. Specifically, one study that came out a few years ago from the Alzheimer's Association's International Conference in veterans, it was in over 250,000 veterans, showed that if they had a report of head injury in their medical record, they were 2.5 times more likely to have a dementia in later life. The specific type of dementia was not classified, but we do know we see this linkage and we see it fairly consistently across different populations and in different groups. And family history. We do know, particularly with Alzheimer's disease, but actually with several other forms of several other types of dementia, that there is a link to family history. If you have a first-degree relative, you are more likely, you have an increased risk to developing Alzheimer's disease in later life. But when we talk about family history, we talk about two kinds. There's risk and there's deterministic, and they are what they sound like. If you have a particular genetic misspelling in your genetic alphabet, that's called deterministic. It means that you will develop Alzheimer's disease and you will develop it at the same estimated age of onset as your parent. Very rare, probably about 500 families around the world have these deterministic misspellings. And we're going to come back full circle to those families at the end. For the majority of people, for the more than 99% of people with Alzheimer's disease, if we're talking about genetics, we're talking more about risk. And that's that there's actually been about 30-some identified risk genes that may be associated with Alzheimer's disease. Probably the most well-characterized of those is a gene called ApoE4, or apolipoprotein E4. We all get one copy from our mother and one copy from our father. If you have one copy of ApoE4, you're at an increased risk. If you have two copies, you're at an even greater increased risk. But there are many people that are living with Alzheimer's disease that have two copies that have no copies of ApoE4, and there are people that have two copies of ApoE4 that are not living with Alzheimer's disease. So that's not the complete story, and that's not the complete puzzle, if you will. And how all of the other 29 or so genetic factors are playing a role is something that we don't totally understand at this point in time. Coming out of the Alzheimer's Association's International Conference, we continue to get hints about what might be other pieces of that puzzle. So I talked a little bit about cardiovascular disease. And for the first time, we saw a report come out this year that looked at type 1 diabetes. So we've seen links to type 2 diabetes, so later life risk and later life factors and how that might impact risk. But this is the first time that we've seen type 1 diabetes, which actually is typically diagnosed in childhood. And you see that same risk, that same link to later life risk for the individuals with type 1 diabetes. Now, I will caution that this is actually based on a closed healthcare system, and it was based on following people over a mark. So how current treatments and what we have in place today to treat or help people with type 1 diabetes isn't figured into this. So when thinking about your loved one or somebody that you may know that has type 1 diabetes that maybe has an insulin pump or has had some other type of treatment through their life, that's going to be different than what these individuals that are in their 70s today experience throughout their life from the time of diagnosis. But it does give an important hint about what might be going on at the underneath in the biology of what might be happening. People that experience type 1 diabetes, what are the changes that are happening inside them that make them at an increased risk in later life? And that's the type of follow-up question that this type of information gives us. We also saw another group of studies that looked at early life factors, so school performance. That school performance at age 9 or 10 may be a predictor in later life risk. And if an individual was a poor performer in school, so had low school performance at age 9 or 10, that in later life, it didn't matter what their profession was, so the complexity of their profession couldn't completely rescue that. And that's something that this is the first time that we've seen that this linkage to early life schooling may be a factor in later life risk. How this is playing a role and what might be happening in the underlying biology is still an open question. And this is one study that certainly needs to be followed up and further investigated. We also saw a group of studies that looked at TV watching and physical activity. So there's a body of evidence that has looked at physical activity and being physically active as being beneficial for later life risk, reducing later life risk. But actually, if you're physically active, what else, then you might, if you're not being physically active, but you're watching a lot of TV, that actually seems to compound that risk in later life. So if you're not physically active, you shouldn't be watching TV, because that combination seems to be worse for you. But I guess the take-home hint here really is to be physically active and promote physical activity throughout life. And a study that Sam's going to talk about in a little bit actually suggests physical activity may be beneficial not only at reducing risk throughout life, throughout the whole life course, but actually also as a treatment for people once they're experiencing memory changes. And probably one of the areas of research that's really starting to get some attention and that's starting to be investigated, and we still don't have a clear picture of how this all fits together. Sam mentioned that there's over 5.3 million Americans that are living with Alzheimer's disease. We know that 2/3 of those are women. Is it that there are more women than men that are living with this disease because they live longer? Is there an underlying biological or genetic reason for why more women have Alzheimer's disease than men? Those are questions that we don't know the answer to. And in fact, earlier this year, did not account or contribute to risk or progression of Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, 3 studies that came out at this year's conference suggest that in a group of women, about 400 women and men that have been followed over time, that women and men that have the same level of memory impairment, called mild cognitive impairment, that women actually decline 2 times faster than men in that study. And similarly, that same group of women actually also have more buildup of that beta amyloid that I talked a little bit about than men in the same study. Again, we don't completely understand what all of this means, but it does suggest that there might be an underlying biological reason for this difference between why 2/3 of the more than 5 million Americans are women. Further, we also had a large study that looked at cognitive performance following surgery. So if all things being equal, if participants had been given anesthesia, women actually had a harder time recovering in terms of cognition than men, and actually had a more significant decline over time than the male counterparts in this study. Again, suggesting that there's an underlying biological difference. At this time, we don't completely, again, going back to that large puzzle, these are just pieces of this puzzle and how this all fits in. But it may give us new information about when you're making decisions for a loved one, or you're making decisions for a person, or when you're thinking about the next steps for medical care, or in terms of risk. And when we have that therapy, whether it's a lifestyle or medical intervention or a pharmacological intervention, we want to be able to identify people at the greatest risk and intervene at the earliest time point.
This was a really interesting example of how we took information about risk factors based on research, and how we were able to translate that into some programs and some information for the general public. So this first piece is really a document that came out that was really a summary of all the research that was out there around modifiable risk factors for cognitive decline and dementia. And what we did was, at the Alzheimer's Association, we conducted this literature review, but we also pulled together all of the researchers who are involved in different modifiable risk factor research. So we looked at folks, and I know you probably heard about these areas, exercise, of course. We looked at diet and nutrition. We looked at social engagement, and we looked at intellectual activity. And you probably heard some of that going around of the research in all 4 of those areas about what we can do. And this is for healthy people, not for people with the disease, but what healthy people can do to continue to stay active in those 4 areas and potentially reduce their risk. So we did this summary. We brought together the researchers to talk about what we sort of came together into this program called Healthy Habits for a Healthier You, that was launched through all of our chapters locally, hopefully in communities near you. Anybody go to one of these programs or see one of these programs? No? Well, maybe you will. So it was just launched in June as part of Alzheimer's and Brain Awareness Month, but it was a way for us to translate some of that research into a program for the general public. And so, like I said, it talks about research in those 4 areas: intellectual activity, exercise, diet and nutrition, and social engagement. So the research behind it, what we know, and then also the modifications that people can make in their life, the what we can do portion of it. And along the same lines, then in June came this sort of consumer campaign that went out to also give some easy reminders to the general public about steps that they could take to also stay healthy and think about not only healthy aging, but also brain health.
So before we go on, I just want to check, does anyone have any questions about what we just shared? So the question is about the percentage of dollars to research for cure and treatment, those types of things, versus helping people live with their families. So do you mean the Alzheimer's Association, or do you mean more broadly? More broadly, the numbers for sure. Yeah, so actually one of the things that the Alzheimer's Association has partnered with the National Institute of Health to do is develop a language for how we talk about our funded research so that we can actually answer those types of questions. So that language allowed us to both define what we funded, define what NIH has funded in this area, and actually expanded beyond that. And there's now about 30-some funders around the world that describe what they fund in research, including NIH, including Canadian Institutes for Health Research, which is the Canadian version of NIH, the Medical Research Council in the UK, which is their primary government funder. And so it does depend on how you would define that. So if you're looking at exercise as a treatment versus things that are risk, how you would define those types of things. But actually you can break it down into non-pharmacological interventions versus pharmacological interventions. So, and how you would, some of those are symptomatic and some of those are trying to stop or slow the progression of the disease. And then some of it's trying to understand the basic science so that you can do any of the above. So it's not, that's why I'm telling you all this, because it's not a simple question. But actually, if you look, I can tell you from our funding, about 20% of our funding is actually testing, or is 20 to 30% actually, based on last year, is related to non-pharmacological interventions, typically. Whether it's developing technologies, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, or whether it's other types of interventions for both individuals or the caregiver. And that was of about 14 million last year. So I can tell you us, but I would actually encourage you to if you just go to Google and type in IADRP, you can get this database. It's a free, open access, searchable resource that allows you to look at all the types of research that are going on around the world, anything on risk, but anything else that we're going to tell you about now. And it would allow you to find researchers maybe in your community that are working on some specific topics or areas. So in that regard, so Sam and I just talked a little bit about risk factors. So what's going to increase or decrease somebody's risk associated with Alzheimer's disease? The ultimate goal is that we can identify people at greatest risk. We can actually confirm that they're at risk. And then when we have that intervention, whether it's lifestyle or whether it's pharmacological, or more likely some type of combination of a variety of factors, we can intervene at that earliest time point to stop or slow the progression of the disease. So think about it like heart disease. So today, for cardiovascular disease, if you go to your doctor, you have a physical, you might have elevated cholesterol or high blood pressure, and your physician or your healthcare provider may tell you, you know what, here's an exercise modification, here's a diet modification that I want you to make, or whatever the variety of lifestyle intervention might be. Here's a medication that I also want you to take, and I want you to do these in conjunction with one another. And we know that on a population basis, that has significantly reduced later life incidence of heart attack or stroke. So it's that same kind of idea. Because we can detect those people that might be at risk, we can actually confirm that they're at risk, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or a variety of other factors. And then we can give different types of interventions, whether it's lifestyle, medication, and sometimes combination of those factors, and we can reduce later life risk of heart attack or stroke. It's that same type of idea for Alzheimer's disease. And that's really where the field is moving. Thinking about Alzheimer's disease as a continuum, we now understand that the underlying biological changes are actually occurring a decade or more before someone's experiencing the memory changes associated with Alzheimer's disease. So what that does give us, that gives us a window of opportunity that we can identify those underlying biological changes and intervene at that time point to see if we're able to stop or slow the progression of the disease. Again, very similar to how we talk about cardiovascular disease. So Alzheimer's disease is a continuum, that what we've traditionally called Alzheimer's is the later stages of the disease, or Alzheimer's dementia. There's a middle window where someone might have mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's, and actually then this earlier window where you might have preclinical Alzheimer's disease or underlying biological changes, but not yet experiencing the memory changes. And so the next section that we're going to talk about is the ability to try to detect that earliest time point. Again, very much like what we do for cardiovascular disease today. So what is a biomarker? You hear this term all the time, and I've actually had people come up to me afterwards and say, well, what is it? What is a biomarker? Is this some sort of magical test that you take and it tells you yes or no? And it's not. So a biomarker is really a biological measure of change. So there's a number of different biomarkers out there, depending on the disease, depending on the condition. I mean, a pregnancy test, for instance, that actually is a biomarker test for a change in an individual. Glucose levels for diabetes, that's a biomarker test. Cholesterol for heart disease that I just talked a little bit, that's a biomarker test. And so there's a lot of examples of research that's going on to detect what are those earliest biological changes, or depending on where you are over that continuum, what might be other biological changes that are going on. Probably the most advanced of these biomarkers is the ability to take a picture of an individual, of a brain, and see the buildup of the beta amyloid. And this is using PET technology. And so what you can see in the boxes on the far side, as you go down, you actually see more and more of these little black dots. And actually in the pictures of the brain, you see more and more color. So those black dots are amyloid plaques, the beta amyloid plaques, one of the hallmark brain changes in Alzheimer's. And so as you're seeing the increase in the color, you're actually seeing that a reflection of the increase of the beta amyloid plaques in those individuals. But PET is somewhat expensive, somewhat invasive, and so is probably not right for the majority of people that are going through a diagnostic workup. And in fact, the Alzheimer's Association partnered with the Society of Nuclear Medicine and Molecular Imaging to say, well, what is the appropriate, when should this type of technology be applied for individuals? And in fact, it was really a very narrow group of individuals that may benefit from adding this onto their diagnostic process. So, for instance, people that are under the age of 65, people that are presenting in a different, more unusual way to their physician would be examples of that. Yeah.
How expensive is it, and in what way is it invasive?
So the two questions is how expensive is it and in what way is it invasive? The expensive, so it depends on the center. I've heard ranges anywhere from $3,000 to $12,000. But I don't know the exact cost. It would depend on the individual. It is not currently covered by Medicare and Medicaid, or for the majority of insurance purposes. In terms of invasive, you actually are you give somebody a radio-labeled compound. It goes into their brain and binds to the beta amyloid. So anytime you're injecting something in the person and then they have to go through a PET scan, it's a more intensive, invasive type of technology in that regard. It's also not available in communities across the country or across the world in thinking about it in that way. It is not a diagnostic for Alzheimer's disease. So there are currently 3 agents that are approved by the Food and Drug Administration, and it is approved as a rule-out diagnostic because about 30% of people that have what we would call a positive or an elevated beta amyloid scan do not yet have the memory changes associated with Alzheimer's. Now, what that may mean, does it mean they're somewhere on that continuum? That's still an open question, and again, we'll come back to that full circle at the end when we're talking about some of the prevention trials that are going on. So this is a rule-out diagnostic for individuals at this point in time. But we're seeing more and more using this type of technology. So we now know that we can take a picture of the brain, see the amyloid changes. And in fact, over the past 2 years at the Alzheimer's Association's International Conference, we've seen technology being developed that you can take a picture and visualize the tau changes that are going on as well over time. And this year, at the Alzheimer's Association's International Conference, we saw new technology with the ability to take a picture and see changes in a specific inflammatory pathway. So again, this is not necessarily specific to Alzheimer's, this is much more broadly in terms of some of the different causes of dementia. But the ability to take a picture and see some of these changes may both make you able to detect changes that are going on over the progression of somebody's disease as a potential diagnostic, or actually also help you monitor the effectiveness of a potential treatment, because we're also seeing the inflammatory system be a target in pharmacological therapy development. We also are probably the second most developed of technologies around biomarkers for Alzheimer's and related dementia is cerebral spinal fluid. So our brain sits in a bath of fluid, and through a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture, you're actually able to spinal fluid and measure changes that might be going on inside. And it gives you a glimpse as to what's happening in the brain, since it's not completely feasible to just open up and take a look whenever you so desire. But again, similar, so CSF is, PET imaging is a little bit more intensive in that way. CSF requires a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap, also not the most pleasurable experience for someone to go through. There's been a lot of work that's going on with beta amyloid and tau and looking at those changes, but actually we saw a report out of neurogranin, another potential marker of change that would be associated with Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. This is actually looking at the cell in the brain, the cell-to-cell communication transmission, so how the cells are talking to one another and how healthy that is. So as the disease, whether it's Alzheimer's disease or related dementia, progresses, you actually will see a deterioration of that communication system. And so this is a potential marker to actually detect that change over time. Again, this is the first time that we've seen this in this large-scale study where they actually saw a correlation to the health of the communication system and the levels of neurogranin in the cerebral spinal fluid. So certainly something that's going to continue to be followed. And then probably the earliest in terms of development is this idea of saliva, the ability to maybe detect changes associated with Alzheimer's disease in your saliva. Ultimately, we don't know what that tool is going to be, whether it's blood or saliva. We see a lot that's being emerging around blood and the potential of detecting changes in blood. At this point in time, both blood and saliva are still very early days, very much in the discovery in terms of what might be that particular panel that you would look at and what that might mean. Is it actually predictive? We've seen a number of different blood panels that have been published in the literature, and to date, none of them have actually, when they've gone and been applied to a larger population, a more diverse population, have they continued to see the same the same accuracy, if you will. And so that's something that there's a very active group looking at in terms of whether it's blood or saliva. We know that there needs to be some type of tool, low cost, non-invasive, that can be used in communities across the country, but across the world, to detect, to identify people that should go for further follow-up. Again, making that parallel to cardiovascular disease. Cholesterol, blood pressure, those are relatively easy, low-cost measures. So whether it's a pinprick or putting a cuff around your technologies that are developing. So you can see when we talk about Alzheimer's disease as a continuum, we're also talking about biomarkers as in the continuum. The idea that there might be these non-invasive, low-cost ways, they're still very in the early days, to get us at that earliest place where we could identify biological changes. And then you have the whole spectrum going into the much more expensive and invasive types of tools and technologies that are also being developed. So putting this all together back in that idea of a continuum, and this just gives you a picture that, I talked a little bit about the genetics and some of the risk genes, like the over 30 risk genes. We don't really know what those mean. But as we continue to understand what all of those factors are and how they're playing a role, you can almost imagine that you would have a barcode, and that the barcode of whatever, you have XY genes and you have XY measure, and you can go through a list of very much those types of ideas as we continue to develop and understand the underlying biology of what's happening and the change over time. So in terms of that now, in thinking about, so we have the factors of risk. So what may be some of the components that increase or decrease somebody's risk associated with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia? The idea being that we want to be able to identify people at the earliest time point, and when we have that intervention, we can intervene at that time point. We need the measure to be able to actually confirm that those individuals are at an increased risk, and that's where we talk about biomarkers, whether it's identifying, continuing to develop. So for both pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions, the idea of a pathway to development before it's available, typically it goes through some type of scaled clinical intervention or study process. So a phase 1 is typically testing the safety of an intervention. Phase 2 is looking at the dosage of the intervention or the level of an intervention. And phase 3 tends to be looking at, does it work? So that's asking the question that we all want to know. Is it beneficial to an individual that's receiving the intervention versus an individual that's not receiving the intervention? So in Alzheimer's disease, when we're talking about pharmacological treatments, there are actually now 6 approved pharmacological agents for Alzheimer's disease. They make up 2 different classes of drugs, cholinesterase inhibitors and glutamate moderators. And then there's actually a newly released combination therapy that actually combines a cholinesterase inhibitor with a glutamate moderator. But these are symptomatic, so there is no evidence that they are stopping or slowing the progression of the disease. The length that a person may benefit from this is very specific to the individual, and I'm sure many of you see this or are very aware of the side effects and some of the other. When we look at Alzheimer's disease on ongoing clinical trials, there are actually over 200 ongoing clinical trials in the United States today, and that's actually a huge increase over the last 5 years. I think 5 years ago it was around 100, then we saw it was like about 120, 150, and now we're seeing it that it's over 200 ongoing clinical trials in the United States today. And one of the other things that we're seeing is a diversity in terms of the for pharmacological treatments, in terms of the biology that's being targeted. So whether it's inflammation, whether it's insulin metabolism, whether it's overall that communication system that I talked about, the protection of that communication system, whether it's amyloid or whether it's tau. We're actually seeing a diversification in what's entering clinical trials from previously where the majority were. Quite a bit of media and buzz around several of the clinical trials that reported out. These three reflect clinical trials that reported out for beta amyloid. And I think the big take-home message is that one of these was an analysis of 2 completed phase 3 trials that as they continued, individuals that had participated in the phase 3 trials, as they continued, they had the option to take the medication. And then they followed those people over time, and so it was an analysis of that information. But that's actually an ongoing phase 3 trial today, and that was solanezumab. Gantenerumab, which is was a phase 3 trial that actually was stopped at midpoint. They actually did an analysis of some of the biomarkers and showed that they, at the highest dose, they had some engagement of the biomarkers and suggest that maybe they needed to have a higher dose as part of their trial. And then the third, which is aducanumab, that's been in the media the last several months. That's the Biogen trial that was a phase 1b, so very early days. Remember, a phase 1 is typically looking at safety, so a phase 1b. And they showed a solid safety and tolerability of this drug, or at least what they claim is a manageable or being able to monitor the various impact of this drug in those individuals. And they do see, as a secondary review of their data, they do see a dose-dependent slowing of cognition or memory changes in individuals that are receiving the drug. But again, this is a phase 1b, so very early days. They've announced that they're actually in recruiting right now for their phase 3 trial. So all of these, until we see the results of a phase 3 trial, it's too early to say how they'll translate to that phase 3, that larger scale particular study. But the big take home is that we're not seeing business as usual. We're actually seeing things being done in a different way. So whether the current phase 3 trial for solanezumab, it's called Expedition 3, and the aducanumab trial that's both was reported and that will go forward. Both of those is actually a way to enroll participants or taking a picture of their brains and confirming that they have beta amyloid before they're enrolling. And that's new. That's the first time that we're seeing this in clinical trials. We also saw 3, again, back to that idea of diversity, of mechanisms and targets of what we're seeing in Alzheimer's disease. The first is that we saw Axovant reported on a phase 2b, and they've announced that they're going to a phase 3. That's looking at a symptomatic, it would be on top of the current treatments that are available that may be also beneficial for those individuals. And they're moving forward to a phase 3. We also saw something that was actually targeting the inflammatory pathway, and that's the TTP488. So looking to target the inflammatory pathway, that's also moving into a phase 3 trial. And then the AVP 923, this is actually for agitation. So not so much looking at the underlying biology of the disease, but actually is there a benefit for these individuals for agitation, which we know is a significant issue that many people with Alzheimer's disease experience. This was tested. It's been approved already in multiple sclerosis and ALS, and they were testing it in this population of Alzheimer's disease and have shown that in a 10-week trial for individuals with Alzheimer's, they saw benefit. Yeah. Yeah, so why don't we save that to the end? Not here, but we can talk about that in the Q&A at the end because that's all kind of a whole different area. Yeah. So the question for those that are listening is, earlier this year there was a report out, or I guess earlier last year, late last year there was a report out from MIT and Harvard about the ability to, in a dish, grow a model of what may be happening in the brain during Alzheimer's disease. So it has the potential of being able to be used as a way to screen and look for different targets and different potential drugs. And so the question is how that's impacting drug development. So we'll save that to the end.
So I'm going to get into some non-pharmacological treatments, but before we do that, does anybody have any questions around the current pharmacological treatments that are out there or the ones that are in the pipeline? And wait, I have one for you, Heather. Why are the names so difficult? Can you give us any feedback on that?
For everyone to go home and practice and then drop it at a cocktail party. Solanezumab, say it after me. Solanezumab, gantenerumab, aducanumab.
Yeah, go ahead.
So how does ABT differ from a chemical strain if it's changing people's behavior chemically?
So it actually, there was no need for restraint in terms of the mechanism. I'm not sure, so I'll have to look it up and I can get back to you. But in terms of, they found that there was a significant benefit for these individuals over time with less side effects or less other impact on their behavior, function, et cetera. So that was the benefit that they claimed. But the mechanism, I'll have to go back to you.
Because the general philosophy, of course, is to find out what causes it,
Yeah.
what triggers it, rather than to
Although I don't believe there's anything approved for agitation in people with Alzheimer's disease, and so that's one of the other distinctions as well. So this is going through the pathway of approval. There is, as of today, there's nothing approved. So whether, just as another aside, yeah. So the question is whether that's the same as Nuedexta. No. And the last row. Solanezumab. So the question is whether solanezumab had a positive impact on younger individuals. So actually, what it was is in these two trials, in Expedition 1 and Expedition 2, those were two phase 3 trials that have concluded. And what they showed is that there was actually neither of those trials had a positive benefit on cognition or function in individuals that received the drug versus individuals that did not receive the drug. However, when they set up the trial, they set up these two simultaneous phase 3 trials to go forward, and they had pre-specified that they were also going to combine all the data and do an analysis. And in that pre-specified analysis, they showed that people that had mild Alzheimer's disease, so had higher scores on their MMSE, one of the cognition tests, that they actually saw a benefit in individuals with mild Alzheimer's disease versus other individuals in receiving the drug versus placebo. And so that suggested that the earlier in the stage of the disease that individuals receive this drug, that it may be beneficial. They since have launched a phase 3 trial, Expedition 3, that is doing just that, actually confirming that people have amyloid in their brain, because that was one lesson learned from the previous two trials. And the second was then looking at people in mild Alzheimer's disease. This report that came out at AAIC took people from the two trials, Expedition 1 and Expedition 2, that did not meet their endpoints, and allowed them at the conclusion of the trial to opt in to continue on the medication for 3.5 years, the experimental drug, for 3.5 years. And at 3.5 years, they showed that people that had been on the drug throughout the trial had been randomized during the trial to receiving the experimental drug versus individuals that had been randomized to receiving the placebo, so not the drug, that they never caught up, so that there was always more of a benefit for people, mild Alzheimer's disease, that had received the drug. So it's called what we call a delayed start analysis. It's the first time that we've ever seen this applied to an Alzheimer's disease trial. So at this point, we have no idea how that's going to translate over to the phase 3 trial, and that's ongoing right now, and that's the Expedition 3. So it's definitely one of the more complex in terms of the analysis and the way that it's designed, because we've never seen this applied to Alzheimer's disease. So we have no way to say what this is going to mean to the ongoing phase 3 trial. To the other part of your question was whether it was a benefit to younger onset. And we'll get to this in a little bit. There's actually 2 of the prevention trials are using solanezumab, and those are still ongoing trials. So we don't know.
So we have a microphone now to make this a little bit easier. So if folks still have a question, do you still have a question up front here? Okay, she has a microphone right there for you.
The combination of Aricept and Namenda, I have not seen that particular combination. Is it being used right now?
So it was just approved in like May, I think. So it's brand new. I have seen it popped up. I've met a few people that are taking it or that have just received it. But it's brand new. It's for people that are already stabilized on donepezil and memantine treatment as an option. But those are the kinds of decisions in terms of whether that would be something you would switch to that should be made with the family and the healthcare provider and the other things about the person's state, condition, timing, all of those things, some of the challenges that the family may face. Yeah, that's part of why it's relatively newly approved by the FDA. Any other questions?
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the non-pharmacological interventions that we're hearing about. And again, it's probably a lot of things that you know work, but now we have some research to show us that it does work, because unfortunately we're in a world so we have to have some research behind it for us to get to the point of it being applicable to different regions, and for us to get the funding, and for us to get the legislation. So this is a good example of a study that looked at care coordination in the home, both with in-person care coordination, some online and website. This was a randomized intervention, which is, one of the best things we could do in research over 18 months the study did show that people with help at home were able to stay in the home 10 months longer than those without help. And again, this is probably not something that you all don't know, right? But it's something that took place in a large randomized trial that is really helpful. It was first presented at AAIC in 2012, and then was presented again. And in 2012 was presented before it was even shared with anyone at the time. It was the first time it came out there, and then represented this year with some additional information and as part of a larger summary of some of the things that are going on in non-pharmacological treatment. This next study is really an exciting one. So we've heard about the importance of exercise for healthy adults, and with the Healthy Habits program that I was talking about and some of the other things, we talked about those 4 quadrants, exercise being one of them. And those of you who run programs like I have, you know that exercise is a big piece of every program with people with the disease, right? So this was actually some new trials that looked at aerobic exercise with people with cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment and vascular cognitive impairment. And we were able to really find some interesting results that exercise or regular physical activity might actually be playing a role in protecting the brain from Alzheimer's, but also allowing people to live better with the disease. So if you see it, those 3 trials down there, one of them showed that there was an improvement in what they call psychiatric system, but really in behaviors. There was really an improvement in behaviors with people with mild Alzheimer's disease. The third one really then looks at people with mild vascular cognitive impairment and how they had improved memory and attention after being involved in regular aerobic exercise. And then the third one was really an interesting one, because they actually found a change in the underlying mechanism of the disease, tau, as Heather was talking about. So they were able to see that the exercise actually was impacting the tau in people with mild cognitive impairment and diabetes. And so this is the first time that we've been able to see some work, some really good research on the importance of exercise for people with the disease in a large trial. So that came out at the conference this year. Another thing that was at the conference this year, and Heather touched on it a little bit, was all about the importance of technology. And again, something that you all might be seeing in your practice too. So we had this pre-conference at Alzheimer's Association International Conference that was around technology and dementia. And it brought together a few different people as part of our professional society called iStart. There's a special interest group our professional interest area that looks at technology, and it brought people together who were part of that group. It also brought people together who received grant awards from us as part of this ETAC program, which is an Everyday Technologies and Alzheimer Care program that funds projects related to technology. And it was really all to talk about what's new, what's going on, how technologies is being integrated into clinical trials now, how there are more collaborative efforts around the world around funding, and also around how people could really combine their data to look at bigger sets and bigger impact. And then really lastly, it was really around the role of technology in research and in care, not only in like data collection and things like that I talked about, but also in just wearable devices and everyday care technologies. These are some of them that you saw here, things related to computers and telephones and monitoring, medication monitoring and things like that. So those were just highlights of some of the interventions. We talked a lot about those 3 new drugs that came out. Some of these interventions around the non-pharmacological things. But now it's sort of, we talked about risk factors, we talked about biomarkers, talked about interventions. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in prevention. So, we saw how huge this disease is going to come, how many people it's going to affect, all of us, all of our families. And so what's going on now in research to help prevent this disease?
So in thinking about prevention, it's the idea that we're moving the needle back so that when we're looking at the underlying biology, we want to identify people that have some biological changes before they have memory changes and intervene at that earliest time point to stop or slow the progression of the disease. So currently there are 5 ongoing prevention trials. At this time, all of these are testing pharmacological interventions for these individuals. What I will say is coming later this year, we will be seeing some prevention trials that are actually testing non-pharmacological interventions, but they have not yet launched, so we didn't include them here today. We're going to talk through a couple of these, but the idea being is that they're looking for markers of people that are in increased risk at the earliest time point to see if they're able to stop or slow the progression of the disease. So we talked about familial Alzheimer's disease, so those are those individuals, that 500 or so families around the world that have that genetic misspelling in their DNA code. Looking at those individuals, looking at people with that risk gene that I talked about, the ApoE4 gene, looking at that 30% of people that if you take a picture of their brain, they have the elevated levels of the beta amyloid, but not yet have the memory changes associated with Alzheimer's disease. And so that's a lot of what these trials are looking at. So one of those is the Alzheimer's prevention trial, and this came out, this is based in Banner, at Banner Institute in Arizona. And this will be launching later this year. And it's looking for that 2 to 5% of the general population that have the 2 copies of that risk gene, ApoE, the ApoE4 gene. They're looking for 1,300 individuals aged 60 to 75, and they're going to be testing 2 different pharmacological interventions, experimental drugs, one called CAD106, which is a monoclonal antibody to the beta amyloid protein. Again, the idea being it would bind the beta amyloid and clear it out of the body. And the one is a beta secretase inhibitor, which actually is responsible for the cutting that results in the beta amyloid production. So it's moving a little bit upstream of before the beta amyloid is made inside an individual. They received $33.2 million from the federal government, which is funding that was made possible as a result of the national plan that I talked about at the very beginning. So tying together a little bit more closely the linkage of how important having a national plan is in terms of all of those different steps and continuing to move the needle forward. And we've seen that in some real results, particularly in these prevention trials. Side note, just to add into this, the Alzheimer's Association is one of the partners with 2 other organizations that has now provided $10 million in funding for this particular trial. And this adds both the addition of different PET imaging, so the ability to take a picture and look at the tau protein and changes over time, to expand the registry that would include enrolling and raising awareness about Alzheimer's disease and about ongoing clinical trials. And then also, when you're talking about enrolling people in this particular trial, you're looking for those people that have 2 copies of the ApoE4 gene. Well, if you're being told you're in the trial, you're also being told that you have 2 copies of the ApoE4 gene. So what does that mean for the person in terms of the genetic disclosure and some of the follow-up and the support that that person may need? And so the Alzheimer's Association has also supported that part of the trial. There's also, when I talked about those families, the familial Alzheimer's disease, Banner, API, the Alzheimer's Prevention Initiative that I just talked about, they have a second trial that's working with one of those families. But the other is the DIAN, the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network trial. That's with those families that have the genetic misspelling. They received a $4.2 million award from the Alzheimer's Association supporting the underlying infrastructure to help them launch the trial. They're testing two different drugs, gantenerumab and solanezumab, two that I had just talked a little bit about. And back to the question that came up earlier about where's the funding has been made possible as a result of the national plan, underscoring the importance of having legislators understand that there is more research needed and where that funding can be applied, or areas where we have need for that type of funding.
Another important point to highlight is really just, again, the translation of some of this research into practice. An interesting thing that we were able to do in conjunction with the international conference this year was to bring together a group of those family members who are part of this Diane trial. So these are people with the disease, younger onset, or family members who either know that they have that gene or could possibly have that gene and haven't been tested. And so it was really a great experience. And as Heather said, this is a very, very small group of people that may be impacted by this, but it was great for them to all come together in this first ever meeting to really talk about their experiences and how this impact their family, and not only interact with each other, but there were opportunities for them to present their stories to the legislators, to pharma, to other researchers. So it was both an educational piece for them, but then also a very support and advocacy type piece for them to really tell their stories to other and get more attention to people who have younger onset disease and how it really impacts their family in a different way. Young children still working, driving, all of those things that we do every day and don't think about, and how somebody in their 40s who ends up getting this disease and how that's impacting their lives. Another prevention trial that we wanted to just touch on that first came out in last year's meeting, but still is one of the gold standards of some of the interventions, non-pharmacological treatments. So you might have heard about this last year. It was, again, a randomized control trial that really looked at combining some of those things I talked about with the Healthy Habits program around healthy aging. So really combining intellectual activity, combining social engagement, diet and nutrition, and exercise. It really looked at, if you had this recipe of all of these different pieces, how those interventions would reduce cognitive decline. Now, it needs to be replicated, it needs to be looked at in diverse populations, but it was really our first effort to look at combining all of those different aspects together in one intervention and how it could impact cognitive decline. So lastly, Heather's talked a lot about millions and trillions and billions. We've talked about a lot of money here, a lot of money that we don't usually see, but we're really in a great position right now where there is 300, I think it's actually like 350 now, $350 million proposed by the House for Alzheimer's research. So we're at a really critical point, and if it is improved, it'll fund more Alzheimer's research, and the biggest increase in funding ever, and more Alzheimer's research across the board. So non-pharmacological treatments, pharmacological treatments, so really looking at everything. So if you're interested in something like that, it's a great way to be informed, learn about it more, and advocate for that. Talk to your legislation. As an association, there's a bunch of things that you could do to stay involved. You guys are involved by being here today, and I know that you wouldn't be here if you're not working with people with disease, but the environment continues to change and new materials continue to help come out. So any way to learn more about the information that's coming out. In supporting research, I come from a program area. I started out working with people with disease way back in 1987 in a daycare center here in Illinois, and I was really very involved with the programmatic pieces of it. I came to the national office and also was able to work in the science area for a while and was really able to learn about the importance of science, not only for pharmacological, but really for non-pharmacological treatments, because, science behind everything that we do every day, the data behind that really just helps make the case for why important it is. So support research, not only non-pharmacological research, but even pharmacological research, which clinical trials. For those of you who work with folks who want to be involved in clinical trials, I don't know if you're familiar with Trial Match. It's part of the Alzheimer's Association's website, but you could go online and find trials near you and that apply to certain criteria. You know, we always have the walk, and I want to also mention about maintaining our overall health, because we learned a lot about how, as healthy older adults, we could continue to look at different quadrants of intellectual activity, social engagement, exercise, and diet and nutrition, all very easy things that are not harmful in any way, but can have might have dramatic effects on our overall health. Lastly, I just wanted to tell you all a little bit about the Essentials program. I know that you might see on the signs and in the program book that the Alzheimer's Association Essentials programs sponsored not only this session, but also the whole dementia track that's part of the conference. So in Essentials yet, anybody? Wow, we got one person, two people. Okay, so all of you got to learn more about Essentials. That's right outside the door. But there's a table right out there. You could talk to our staff. But, you know, it's really part of a collaboration with Healthcare Interactive and the CARES program. So Essentials is a certification exam that's based on topics from our dementia care practice recommendations. Some of you might have heard about those that the Alzheimer's Association puts out about what good care looks like. And so you could take this online course, or your whole facility could take this online course and become certified in Essentials. And if you already have a course that exists, you could also have your course or your curriculum reviewed by the association in conjunction with the dementia care practice recommendations, so that you can see if they meet some of the recommendations that are provided by the association. One exciting thing that will be happening in the months and years to come is that the association is looking at revising the dementia care practice recommendations. For those of you who are familiar with them, or if you're not, you could look again at the table out there. I know there's a sample copy out there, but there are practice recommendations in different areas like assisted living in nursing homes, home care, end-of-life care, and we're really looking at how those practice recommendations are going to be revised based on the essentials or the fundamentals of what good care looks like, no matter what setting you're in. And so there'll be one universal set of dementia care practice recommendations. We're still in the process of working on that plan and continuing to work with other organizations who helped endorse the last recommendations. There were over 30 organizations that came on board. And so another process like that will take place with these new revised recommendations. So if you need us, we're always here by phone, in person, and online, alz.org. You can check us out. And with that, I know we talked about a lot of stuff, a lot of words, a lot of high-level information, I think, in some places.
Help accelerate screening it. So when you're looking at when you're talking about drug development, if you saw in that pathway, you had this big funnel, right, that went down to things in phase 3, and you had tens of thousands of potential compounds that were up here. It's still very exciting because it's adding another tool to our arsenal in terms of drug discovery, and hopefully we'll be able to accelerate that pipeline, and that what we see in this model, or when things are screened or tested in this model, we're going to see them translate better than we've seen. It's cool. It's still early days, but from the science, it's pretty cool.
Hi, I was just curious as to any research that's going on specifically for in the long-term care industry around caring for people with Alzheimer's disease and their professional caregivers. If there's any research that's being done right now as far as showing best practices or anything that we should be kind of on the lookout for.
So there are actually, if you go, Sam talked a little bit about Trial Match, which is alz.org/Trial Match, and that has all sorts of ongoing clinical studies that are going on across the country that have received the ethical approval to be done. And that's not just pharmacological. So I think when people hear clinical studies, they think, oh, it's the ongoing drug trials. That's not, in fact, the case. In fact, it's much broader than that. This is for a caregiver. that also could be in there. Whether it's surveys of perceptions of disease, that can also be on there. So there are many different types of trials that are out there that are ongoing. And so yes, there are actually quite a few that are ongoing in terms of different interventions for a person, either the person living with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia, or for their care partner. And so depending on the particular study, and there's too many to go through, but yes, that is absolutely going on.
I think just to add to that too, I think that's a great database to look for some of the best place for us to be involved to make the most impact. We know that there's a lot of people out there that we don't serve, and a lot of people in different types of industries that we could collaborate more and work better with. And so as part of this big strategic assessment, we're looking at programs that are out there that are evidence-based, that are making a difference in long-term care settings, in other settings too, to see if the programs that we offer, as well as the programs that are out there, what has the best evidence and what's going to make the most impact and help the most people in long-term care facilities, in the community. And so part of that is going to help us with the strategic plan to figure out where we best are to be involved as an organization and who we partner with, who we we can't do everything, everybody can't do everything themselves, but we know there are a lot of people out there who need help, and so we're trying to figure out, again, through this assessment about where it might make sense. And so the reason I'm bringing that up is because I think that what's coming out of that assessment, again, is a lot of programs that are evidence-based. We're able to see a bunch of randomized controlled trials that are being done in care settings, as well as some other more observational studies that still have some rich data out there. Set her hand up for a while, yeah.
I'm interested to know if there's any research that shows the average length of time somebody is in one of these stages within that continuum, and if so, what factors might impact that about the person or their environment or their care?
No, that's a great question. And so when you're thinking about where we are from a research perspective and thinking about Alzheimer's disease as this continuum, and that we have these biological changes over time, that somebody may be at increased risk. So at this point, a lot of that, some of it in the earlier stages, in the preclinical and even in MCI due to Alzheimer's, that's still very much in a research setting in terms of being able to identify what are those earliest changes. We don't know what and how to detect them. We have some tools that are being developed, but there may be better tools. And so a lot of that is still being very much investigated and researched. And so the length of time, that's a great question. I wish we knew. And part of, if you think again, comparing it to cardiovascular disease, a lot of what we understand about cardiovascular disease and the changes that, and the time from when someone has elevated cholesterol to when they might have a clogged artery to when it may lead to something else down the road, a lot of that comes from a large study that followed a lot of people over a long period of time called Framingham. It's in like its 60th or 70th year, third or fourth generation at this point in time. They're now actually adding cognition into that study, and they've done it for the last generation or so. Because just to that point, we don't know. We don't know when those underlying biological changes are. Depending on this study, there's been some evidence that it's a decade and maybe even 2 decades before someone has the underlying memory changes. But how far back we go, some of those studies haven't been done yet.
How about with the stages of dementia? Once
you have Alzheimer's disease in terms of the progression through the 7 stages, if you will, of dementia. So the average length of time is, I think it's 4 to 8 years, depending on, again, it somewhat depends on the study, and that's based on prevalence data from around the country. So 4 to 8 years is the average time from the time of diagnosis until someone passes away. But I meet people all the time that have been living with dementia for 10 or 20 years, and in my own family it's been about 15 years. So there is no one equation, if you will, for a person. Are there factors in terms of environment? Are there factors in terms of whether they're participating, they're a certain diet or a certain regimen? We don't know. So the best study that we have today to actually give you some sort of recipe is from the finger study that Sam talked about, which is where they actually put a recipe together. That's not people with dementia. That's cognitively healthy people that are followed over time.
So there's nothing new about at each of the stages of dementia how long somebody might, not the whole 4 to 8 years, but just early stage, moderate,
It depends on the
severe.
person.
And there's nothing to
There
indicate
doesn't.
what impacts that. Okay, thank you.
Now, I think the best guess, based on what we do know, is that it's a variety of factors. It's a combination of factors. You know, the studies that we came out about physical activity, that may have a role, but exactly what, we don't know. Exactly what a role diet plays, or diet from midlife, we don't know. There's evidence that there are factors in midlife that impact that in late life, but all the pieces of the puzzle, we just don't have them all together.
Probably have time for one more question if there is one. All right, well, thank you very much. If you do have a question, you could come on up here and ask us.
And I think there's a code that you need for your evaluations.
Okay,
Thank you all.
thank you.
Just a reminder, the code that you need for this session is